This is another iRaw podcast.
Hi, welcome to Storytelling Animals, a green new podcast of climate ecology and animal justice. Today my guest is Thom van Dooren. He's a field philosopher at the University of Sydney and the University of Oslo. He's the author of several books in what's known as extinction studies, the ethics, the cultural effects, the science of extinction. Most recently, that just came out this month, A World in a Shell, Snail Stories for a Time of Extinction. In this book, he wants us to really get to know snails, how they're entangled with the lives of the other creatures and the humans who live in Hawaii. He's talking about the snails of Hawaii specifically, and also, think of each of the hundreds of species of snail as has a unique way of going through the world, is a unique form of life, unique way of experiencing. You might be thinking, gosh, do I really want to listen to an hour-long podcast about snails? Selfishly, I think the answer is yes. But I would say my experience reading the book was I came in thinking, Van Dooren's previous book was about birds, and I'm kind of more into birds than I am into snails. Like, how excited am I going to be about reading this book about snails? But I ended up loving it. I ended up loving snails, and I hope this podcast can start to convince you why, and if you decide to pick up the book, that will go even farther down that road, the road to loving snails. So, some housekeeping notes. Next week is our book club discussing White Skin, Black Fuel on the Dangers of Fossil Fascism by Andreas Malm and the Zetkin Collective. And then toward the end of November, on November 29th, we will be discussing Salvage the Bones by Jesmyn Ward. So if you're interested in either of those, you can learn more about the book club at daytonmartindale.com/book-club. There's some links in the episode description. If you enjoy this episode, please send it to a friend you think might like it, post it on social media, rate, subscribe to this podcast. And if you really like it, please consider donating on Patreon, patreon.com/storytellingpod, a small monthly donation to help keep this podcast going. Thanks so much, and on to Thom van Dooren and the snails. Hi, I'm here with Thom van Dooren, the author of A World in a Shell, Snail Stories for a Time of Extinction. Thom, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks very much for having me. It's great to speak with you.
Yeah, so this book is about extinctions. You've written some previous books on extinctions. What first sparked your interest in writing and researching that topic?
Yeah, well, that was quite a while ago now. I mean, so I've been working on extinction for over a decade, I guess, and I came to it in a sort of a roundabout way. I did my PhD on agricultural plants and farmers' relationships with plant varieties. And through that work, I guess I got very interested in the loss of agricultural crop varieties and the efforts to conserve them over the last few decades in particular. Efforts to bank them or to keep them moving in communities and so on. And that really led me into thinking about biodiversity loss more generally. So I've done that now in a couple of books and focused on birds. When I first turned to thinking about biodiversity loss more generally beyond the agricultural world, the first book out of that was Flightways, and I thought originally that book would be about would have chapters on some plants, some animals, all sorts of different creatures. But I sort of fell into writing and thinking about birds, and sort of stuck with it. And the book became a book all about birds. And then I guess the last chapter in that book was about the Hawaiian crow, which in a way sort of segued into the next book, which was all about crows around the world, including the Hawaiian crow. So I've sort of move around in terms of case studies with the kinds of creatures that capture my attention, where I think there are really interesting and important stories. But I keep coming back to this focus on extinction, and that's really, I guess, because it fascinates me, and I think it's one of the real key challenges of our time, is to understand what extinction means why it matters, and then hopefully to do something about it. And I guess as a philosopher and a writer, my avenue into doing something about it is to try and tell powerful extinction stories that change the way we think and feel about the world.
Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, you mentioned kind of your previous two books focused on birds, which maybe are more traditionally charismatic and arguably kind of easier ways into getting people to care about extinctions than, at least on the surface, snails would be. So how did you end up going from birds to snails?
Well, that was another one of those kinds of accidental developments. I was in Hawaii working on the birds. I've been working in Hawaii for about 10 years now, and I get a friend introduced me to one of their friends, Mike Hadfield, who I talk about in the book. And Mike was basically running this makeshift snail ark at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And for several decades, he'd been looking after snails, even though he's not a snail biologist. It's not really his area, but he sort of, again, fell into it because no one else was taking care of these snails that were disappearing. So I started, talking to Mike, but more as a friend than an informant. And he introduced me to the snail community. And I guess I slowly fell in love with snails. They're not creatures who I knew much of anything about, really, before I started the work. But at the same time, I also got to know the snail community in Hawaii and was really drawn into their passion for these creatures. And a big part of that, I guess, is, as you just pointed out, that they're not so charismatic, although Hawaii snails are, many of them at least, particularly beautiful. So I encourage people to Google for some Hawaiian tree snails to see their beautiful shells and so on. But they're still not that charismatic, and the job of getting people to care for them is quite difficult. And so I guess I slowly began to see the snail story in Hawaii as one example of a much bigger, more pervasive problem around the loss of invertebrates and the loss of uncharismatic species, and the need to find ways to tell stories to raise interest and curiosity and concern about the 99% of the animal kingdom that is the invertebrate world that is also disappearing, that I had sort of been not ignoring, but it hadn't been a part really of my work up until then.
Yeah, so we're definitely going to talk more about snails shortly, but just kind of from the standpoint of writing this book, you said you're a writer and philosopher. In the book you call yourself a field philosopher, but it's an interesting book because it's part philosophy, part really like science journalism, and part history, and it's various forms of storytelling worked in. So what what do you see as your task as a field philosopher, and how did you approach this book?
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad it's an interesting book for all of those different voices and approaches woven in that. That's what I had hoped for, and I set about in writing this book trying to do something a little bit different in terms of genre. I wanted to write it as a trade book, as a book that was broadly accessible to anyone who's interested. But at the same time, I didn't want to write it as a conventional sort of piece of science journalism. I wanted to hold on to those philosophical questions that animate my interest in snails and in extinction, but to take them to a broader audience. And I guess I've tried to do that in a way in my previous books too. But in this case, I guess the philosophical questions are in a way even more submerged in the narrative. They're definitely not gone, but they're not accompanied by a whole lot of footnotes and citations or dense philosophical discussion. They're sort of there in the storytelling, and that's something I've been working on, as I said, in previous books, but it's a little bit more submerged still in the snail book. And so it's an effort to tell this story, tell this history of the disappearance of Hawaii snails, but even earlier than that, of how all of these snails got to Hawaii, and to cultivate in the reader a sense of appreciation, curiosity, and concern, but at the same time to raise these kinds of questions about how we know the world, our place in the world or places, our obligations to one another, and how to think through and respond to all of this in a time of extinctions. So I guess there's a lot going on, and I think that effort to be broadly accessible is a big part of what I take field philosophy to be about. I think there are many people doing different things with that term, but for me, part of it is about just doing philosophy in a way that is broadly accessible. But it's much more than that. And I've since my PhD research, incorporated interviews into my philosophical work and thinking. I've gone out and talked to people and incorporated other kinds of ethnographic methods. And that's really about doing philosophy in the world with others. It's about taking your questions to others. It's about being interested in others and what they have, other people, whether they're scientists or hunters or indigenous peoples, what they have to offer as sort of really meaningful philosophical interventions, and trying to think with them. And that's something that, of course, anthropologists and others have always done, or done for a very long time at least, but philosophers not so much. So that's part of it. And so taking our questions out into the world, and in doing that, I guess that there is definitely an ethical charge to that effort to think with others. As Isabel Stengers puts it, I think, she talks about taking up our questions in the presence of those for whom they matter most. So I think we learn to think differently with others. We learn to ask different kinds of questions, to be moved and provoked by the world differently when we take our philosophy out of the armchair or the office, I guess. So there's a lot more, I guess, that flows from that. But what I'm trying to do in this book is to take up some of those methods and to tell these stories in that kind of an accessible way that holds these philosophical questions at its core, but does that in a really accessible way.
Yeah. So kind of building off that, I consider myself an animal lover, an animal advocate. I have a podcast that's largely about animals. I write about animals, but I don't think I had, strong feelings about snails in particular, one way or another. I mean, I liked them insofar as I like animals, but until I read your book. And then by the end of chapter 1, I was a total snail partisan. And now I think they're super cool and we need to save them all. So just kind of, especially from that first chapter about slime, what were some of the most remarkable facts about snails that you learned in your research for this book that really stood out to you?
Yeah, well, the first chapter, as you say, is all about slime, and slime really was, it wasn't my entryway into thinking about snails. That came actually through biogeography, which I think is another fascinating part of the snail story. But very early on, I got fascinated by slime, and I guess because it is such a derided substance, and I think it's one of the main reasons many people have a problem with snails. It's a key part of the kind of ickiness that puts people off. So I really wanted to dive right into the slime and think about what its evolutionary function is and what it does in the world, and to try and find a way to appreciate the snails through it. So that was one part of it, but the other was the moving beyond the shells, I guess, of snails, especially with the Hawai'i snails that have, many of them at least, have such beautiful, colourful shells. Yeah. It's kind of easy to think those are beautiful, but to ignore the fleshy, slimy bit. But what happens when we do that, I think, is we very easily segue into collecting snail shells, which is not, in my view, a very good way of coming to appreciate snails. And what we gloss over really quickly is these living beings that actually inhabit a world, sense and perceive a world, move through the world, and actually are up to all sorts of really fascinating things. So that first chapter is really an effort to do exactly what it sounds like it did for you, which is wonderful to hear, to really get people to appreciate that snails are these beings that inhabit their own kind of miniature, fascinating worlds. And so through the slime, we look at some of the work on snail cognition and behaviour that's going on around the world, looking at how snails navigate, how they are able to read the slime trails of others to pick up all sorts of interesting information about other snails, and So how the slime contributes to a thick social and spatial sense of the world. And so we also consider some of the work on snail chemoreception and how snails smell, taste the world around them, how their perceptual apparatus work differently to most humans with our vision-centered focus on the world. So they're inhabiting, very different Umwelten in von Uexküll's terms, and yet they are these sort of fascinating worlds that include, and this was a bit of a shock to me too, but that include the fact that snails are social creatures in some sort of way. They deliberately hang out together when they're estivating, sealed up in their shells, that they experience overcrowding, but also social isolation in ways that are that impact on their ability to form memory, on their metabolic functioning, like their ability to develop and grow their shells. So they are tuned into a social world in a way that is, I'm sure, vastly different to the way that most humans are tuned into a social world. And yet there is something called snail sociality. And I think just beginning to have a sense of those things, even though we can't understand them and inhabit them in any full sense, but we can begin to have some sort of a sense of the thickness of snail worlds, that it exceeds the kind of ick factor. And I think that is a pathway into a different kind of appreciation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot I want to jump off from that answer, but you mentioned, people like collecting shells, and you have kind of this wild history of how white people arriving in Hawaii went pretty out of control collecting snail shells, but that is not necessarily far from the only threat that snails faced in Hawaii and still are facing. So what are right now some of the major threats facing Hawaii's snails?
Yeah, well, right now, so I should say Hawaii had over 750 species of land snails, and which makes it one of the most diverse assemblages of snails anywhere on the planet, which is itself really fascinating. So to compare it to North America, a landmass that's 1,700 times the size of the Hawaiian Islands. The number of snails in Hawaii is about 2/3 the number found in the whole of North America. So it's a place that is abundant in snails, and they weren't just diverse; they were abundant in number. And so there are lots of descriptions from these early naturalists of snails hanging from the trees like bunches of grapes, that they were really abundant. And these tree snails, of course, it probably is not that well known that tree snails didn't eat vegetation, like, eat the plant leaves themselves. Instead, they scrape a layer of microorganisms off the surface of the leaves. So they're basically cleaning the leaves as they move through the trees. So they weren't harming the forests. We don't really know what they were doing in the forests. There are different theories about what their ecological role might have been. But so these abundant snails were up in the trees cleaning them, and they were also down in the soils recycling dead leaf matter, which was really important in Hawaii before the arrival of earthworms relatively recently. The snails did a lot of the work of making the soil on these volcanic islands. So, yeah, they're fascinating, diverse creatures in Hawaii. There were, as I said, at least 750 species, probably many more that haven't been described. And today there are almost 2/3 of them are gone. And the ones that remain are disappearing for a range of reasons, but the biggest contemporary cause is predation. So especially another snail, the rosy wolf snail, the Euglandina rosea, that's been brought into the islands deliberately to try and control another snail that was brought into the islands, the giant African snail, which some people felt was a pest. So this predatory snail was brought in to try and consume these giant African snails. It didn't. Instead, it ate the native species.
And what I want to bring out there, that one of the most infuriating parts of the book is that when they brought in this wolf snail, no one checked whether it would prey on the native snails or have any negative impacts, or even really seem to be thinking about it. They just said, oh well, we caused this one problem with an introduced snail. What if we introduce a different snail to solve it? And I don't know, it's just such frustrating thinking.
It is, yeah, and and yet it was surprisingly common. Efforts for biocontrol in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and still today in some cases, really not enough thought went into this, and I think there's something really in that, and there's many things in it, but one of the things that's in it in this case is that the people making those decisions in Hawaii, the territory was at this stage Hawaii was a territory of the US, so it was the territorial government. Just really, I think, didn't care about the local snails. There was a small community of people who were studying them in the middle of the 20th century, but yeah, by and large, I guess if they weren't contributing to the economy or contributing in some other way, they weren't really factored into this decision making, which I guess goes to a particular kind of worldview, a particular way of valuing biodiversity or valuing plants and animals that I hope has transitioned into something else. But we still do get this kind of careless thinking, and I very briefly in the book mention the enthusiasm that some people have for a nematode that they're proposing, which is used in agricultural settings to kill snails and slugs. And so there's now been a proposal that it might be introduced to Hawaii to control the rosy wolf snail. Again, no work done to see whether this nematode will kill the native snails. So none of the scientists who are passionate about Hawaii snails that I've spoken to have been in support of this nematode proposal, but that it is even floated still without anyone actually doing any of that work is just pretty mind-boggling. Mm-hmm. But I digressed. I mentioned the predators as a main cause of extinction today, the rosy wolf snail, but others, including the rats and chameleons that have arrived in the islands, also eat snails. But then, as you say, I really in the book I really wanted to not just tell that story that villainize. What's my word here? That turns into a villain those introduced species, which I think is what we very often do with predators of endangered species, especially where they're relatively recently arrived in a place. They become the villains, and we sort of fail in a basic obligation of curiosity to tell more complex, deeper historical stories about how we ended up where we did, which is. Which in the case of Hawaii is about shell collecting in some cases, decimating some species, but it's also about a much longer history of habitat destruction, which happened for all sorts of things, from agriculture to including sugar and pineapple plantations and ranching. In Hawaii, the military control an awful lot of land, especially on Oahu, and they continue to blow up and destroy snail habitat in different places. So it's a complex set of factors that are involved historically and still impacting today in some ways. I think we have to hold all of that complexity together in the book, together in the stories we tell, and that's what I try to do in the book, in an effort to I guess move beyond this sense that we are inhabiting an anthropogenic extinction crisis in which humanity is destroying plants and animals, to really zero in on the particular forms of human life, the particular social and economic and cultural systems that are driving this extinction crisis. And that's one of the key agendas of the book, is to complicate that story about an anthropogenic extinction crisis.
Mm-hmm. So, you mentioned that a lot of the people working in the mid-century who were especially, agricultural interests who wanted the rosy wolf snail there to help control so-called pests didn't necessarily care about the native snails. I think a maybe natural question is why should we? And there are a bunch of different angles we could take. We could care because we care about individual snails and their cognition in their world. We could care because of some ecological role they have, which, although you mentioned that we aren't totally sure what exactly that is, but I'm curious, as if there are hundreds of snail species, why should we care about a snail species? And I know there's a million answers, and that's what the whole book is about. But what if someone asked you that on the street, where would you start?
Yeah, well, I would be very bad at giving a simple answer on the street, I think, but I'll do my best.
Well, I can break it down too. If you mentioned the term Umwelten earlier, and kind of, which is sort of the experience perceptual world that a given animal has or a given creature has, and what thinking of species as a form of life, what does that mean?
Yeah. That's been a big part of my thinking since Flightways, where I tried to think about species as forms of life moving through evolutionary time, and tried to make an argument there about the importance of recognizing and holding on to those ways of being in the world as emerging and evolving projects that we have an obligation to. And I think I definitely am taking up that thread in this book too. And chapter 2 is sort of in conversation with chapter 1 of Flightways and chapter 2 of the Snail book. And although I don't make that explicit, it was really my effort to rethink the way I'd been thinking about Flightways in the ways that I was forced, I guess, or prompted to by the snail situation. I can say more about that. I should say more about that, but I'm drifting away from your question. So I guess the argument for why we should care about snails in this book is, as you say, really multifaceted. And I have always resisted this dualism, I guess, between that's often thrown around in environmental philosophy, between intrinsic and instrumental value, and that we ought to come down firmly on one side of that divide and value or have ethical obligations to other species on the basis of either intrinsic or instrumental values. I really want to multiply values and multiply the ways in which we
just to sort of
appreciate. Yeah.
Break down those two terms. Intrinsic would be the snail has value regardless of whether humans can use them, and instrumental would be they have value for their use to humans and other creatures. Is that more or less right?
Precisely, thank you. Mm-hmm. Sorry, I drift off into jargon only very occasionally, and not in the book very consciously.
No, you don't use those terms in the book.
Yeah,
I don't think.
I don't. No, this is sort of the trouble with doing the kind of field philosophy we're talking about. I'm having a lot of these conversations, but they're just in my head. I keep them out of the book, and so then unfortunately, when people start to ask me questions like this, I get to make some of that thinking visible, which sometimes is submerged even from myself, or things that I have. I spend a lot of time puzzling through these questions, but it doesn't make it into the book, and so I very quickly forget the long process of thinking that brought me there. So it's lovely to talk about the book, but
I'd love for you to make some of that thinking visible too.
So yeah, really, I want to say that the snails matter in a whole range of different ways, and I definitely want to hold on to this sense that they have intrinsic value. They matter in and of themselves, irrespective of who else they might be good for. And that's really what's going on in chapter 1 that we've already talked about, the argument about the life worlds, the Umwelten of the snails, and coming to appreciate that these are remarkable creatures who have a right in some sense. Not that I like the rights discourse, but have that we have an obligation to hold open space for in the world. But then from chapter 1 onwards, the rest of the book is really trying to draw out different ways in which their disappearance matters. And so, yes, some of them are slowing down with these questions of the ecological roles that they might have. Chapter 2 really is trying to think about their value as part of a kind of evolutionary assemblage, and what that might mean and how that might make demands on us. The chapter on the military is really thinking about snails as allies in the struggle for livable worlds. That they might actually be important allies in helping us to fight against militarism and to hold open room for cultural diversities as well as the protection of environment. So each of the chapters, in a different way, actually has a sort of is trying to draw out a different mattering, if you like, a different thing that's lost or threatened by the disappearance of snails. And this is really grounded in what Debbie Bird Rose, who I worked with a lot earlier in my career until she passed away, we once called the entangled significance of extinction. That was an effort to flesh out all of these, or not all, we can't do that, but to flesh out the multiple ways in which extinction matters and ripples out into the world to impact on lives and landscapes, while also holding on to that core commitment to the what we've been talking about as the intrinsic value of the species. So holding all of that together is what we meant by the entangled significance of extinction. And so this book is an effort to do that in a kind of slowed down way, I guess, across multiple chapters.
Well, snails can relate to being slowed down. But yeah, you talk about snails as not a member, but a participant in the species, and kind of a species as a process or even a project of its members rather than a static thing. And yeah, maybe, you mentioned that chapter is in conversation with Flightways. It might be a lot to ask you to explain two different books in this podcast instead of just one, but how has your thinking on that? How did it change by confronting snails, or how did it develop? And yeah, how did that conversation play out?
Yeah, well, back in chapter 1 of Flightways was about it was also in the Hawaiian Islands, actually in the Kupuna Islands, or the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, where the albatross live. So yeah, that chapter was thinking about albatross species, the Laysan and black-footed albatross, as these intergenerational projects that are holding themselves in the world. And it spent a bit of time thinking about albatross reproduction and the work that goes into producing the next generation of chicks, and how that was all being threatened and in some cases lost to rising sea levels and plastics and other things that were really impacting on the species, but impacting on it in particular at that junction, that intergenerational junction, where one generation tries to bring forth the next, either by flooding nesting habitat in low-lying nesting islands, or by feeding plastic to chicks, which was and still is often happening and causing the death of these chicks. So I was really interested there in the intergeneration, the breakdown of that intergenerational process of transmission, and what that means and what kinds of demands it makes on us. And in order to get to that, I was thinking through this concept of the flight way, of the species as a way of life that's stretched over evolutionary time, that is working to hold itself in the world in really literal ways with the albatross. And that those processes of intergenerational transmission are being threatened. That doesn't all work so neatly with the snails. I think it does work in some way, but I think it probably works for all species, even though the work that goes into bringing the next generation forth is not as obvious as it is with the albatross for many other species. But when I came to thinking about snails, I was really struck by, well, firstly, the difficulty I had thinking about individual species, that there are over 750 species that I was trying to reckon with, and I had having a lot of trouble holding some of those differences in my head. And the taxonomy is also often still being revised in some cases. So we're dealing sort of straight away, I think, with an assemblage of species. And this is the case for invertebrate conservation more generally. It's often conservation done in bulk, rather than thinking about single species like the Laysan albatross. And so we need to start to think quite differently straight away, I think, about what's going on here. And so with the snails, I got very interested early on in their biogeography, how they all got to Hawaii. And I started to think about rather than thinking of it as sort of a singular flight way through evolutionary time, as I had been with the albatross, I started to think about it as a network of multiple species that is spread out across the Pacific Ocean. When we start to think about how all these snails moved to Hawaii and the other islands where the ancestral species of some of them are found, and how after they arrived in Hawaii, they began to diversify. And that's a story that's a lot to do with the landscape of Hawaii and the ideal conditions that it provides for speciation. And so the scientists think that somewhere between 20 and 30 species of snails probably made it to Hawaii over the last 5 million years. And they probably made it on birds, that they traveled on birds to Hawaii. And then between the islands, they most likely moved around by a wind or storm. Some of them are blown around, or they float around on logs to a nearby island. And all of these really random processes of separation and isolation and drifting into new environments give rise to new species. And so from these 20 or 30 arrivals, all of which would have been tiny little snails, we have this incredible speciation of 750 at least, probably many more species of all sorts of shapes and colours and sizes. And so I was trying to hold on to that process as an evolutionary and biogeographical process, and to think about it as a process of millions of years of unlikely movements of that have produced this utterly unrepeatable assemblage of life, and to just try to give an account of that makes some of that history visible. And I think just by describing it, and I've done that very poorly here, I hope I do a better job of it in the book, just by describing it, I think we are drawn into a different kind of appreciation for exactly what was here, how long it took to come into the world, and how quickly it's now being sort of truncated and stamped out. So again, it's an effort to think about what demands might be made on us by this long evolutionary history, but there isn't the sort of singular flightway that I guess preoccupied me in Flightways. There is this more complex assemblage of life that I think makes a very similar kind of set of demands, but a lot of what I end up reflecting on in that chapter is how this draws us into an encounter with mystery and unknowability, and the fact that that this is an assemblage of life stretched across oceans of space and time that we just can't really understand, and yet we are destroying it before we've even had a chance to understand it in the limited kinds of ways that we might.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess another way in which these species matter is the way in which they interact with, the humans of Hawaii, and in particular the indigenous peoples there. Like, how do snails feature in native Hawaiian stories?
Yeah, well, they feature in a lot of ways, and this was, of course, another one of the things I really wanted to capture in the book. And I didn't want to tell Kanaka Maoli native Hawaiian stories, snail stories. I didn't think that was my place. I mention some of them, and I try to give a sense of, I guess, the really key significant, or the key role that snails play in a lot of Kanaka stories is as this voice that sings in the forest at night, and not just at any old time, but they sing as a sign, often in the arc of a story. They sing at a time to indicate that everything is pono again, everything is righteous, correct, and good. It's sort of been resolved as it should. So they have this really important role as symbols and omens and a musical presence, sometimes called the voice of the forest. So I spend a little bit of time in the book thinking about that and talking to Hawaiian cultural practitioners and to scientists as well, and to really all sorts of people about this singing in the forest, and what it means, and how to understand it. And so that's a big part of I guess, the cultural significance of snails, but more generally, I guess I'm interested in what the disappearance of these culturally significant creatures means, and how that fits within a Hawaiian worldview, where these creatures in the forest are, for many Native Hawaiians, they're kinolau, they're embodiments of the deity's ancestors, and so when they disappear from the forest, and this is not just the snails, it's the birds and the plants and others who are lost. There's for some people, and I draw this out through an interview I did, especially with the kumu hula, the teacher of hula, Kodi Pueo Pata. So Pueo was telling me about the breakdown of religious and cultural practices in hula as these species disappear, as these god forms disappear from the world. It's no longer possible to have the kinds of relationships with them that are normally taken up through hula, and so that part of the religion, Pueo told me, disappears, and so I guess that's a theme that I've been interested in other work and in other parts of the world too, how the disappearance of species ripples out into the world to transform people's lives, to transform cultural practices, to change the world and remove a layer of meaning and storied significance from the world. So I wanted to draw all of that out in the book, but I didn't want the discussion of Kanaka Maoli relations with snails to be limited to those more traditional cultural relationships. And so I have another chapter in the book that I've already mentioned that's about the US military, and that's really about this valley, Makua Valley in the Waianae coast of Oahu, where a Kanaka group called Malama Makua, which means Malama means to care. So caring for this valley, this group have opposed the US military's use of this valley as a weapons dump and test and live fire training site. And they have, in some ways, used the snails as a kind of ally in those struggles against the military. So that chapter is really trying to think about the shifting cultural significance of snails and other plants and animals. And one of the contemporary forms of cultural significance that I think the snails are having in somewhere like Makua Valley is as an ally in struggles for the protection of land and culture. And I think that's an important element of the snail story too in Hawaii.
Yeah, maybe we've been talking about a lot of things we are losing and things that are disappearing. But how is that alliance doing? What are some of the efforts being made to protect snails in Hawaii?
Yeah, well, there are those efforts to conserve habitat and landscapes more generally, like in Makua Valley. It's probably too late for Makua Valley, really. There's still some trees around the ridgelines and things, but the valley is pretty destroyed by a lot of decades of fires and so on. But there are other efforts to conserve forest habitat in other parts of the islands that are vitally important. And then I guess there's the really big picture question about climate change and its impacts on moisture-dependent animals like snails, and what that will mean in the future. So there's some of those sort of bigger picture landscape and atmospheric processes that are really going to matter, that do matter for snails, that there are some efforts to try and address, but of course they're very big problems. So what I really focus in on in the book is those more snail-centered, I guess, conservation efforts, which at this stage, as the snails are disappearing so quickly, have really become about banking, if you like, the species in one way or another. So there's two key sites that I talk about in the book, and they each sort of get their own chapter. One of them is the forest exclosures, which are these fenced areas in the forest that have with these very specially designed fences that keep out their predators. So they're small patches of forest in which snails can be basically rescued from the surrounding areas and put into these more secure spaces to live out their lives. And then that's sort of discussed mostly in the first chapter of the book. And then in the last chapter of the book, we go to the what's usually called the lab, but I think about it as an ark in the book, which is basically a trailer that is full of these environmental chambers that are like refrigerators, basically, where snails are kept in an environment in small containers that replicate the moisture and temperature conditions that they would normally have experienced. So these are the two sites in which most of Hawaii snails go on living at the moment, and really for most species of the species that remain, their numbers are so diminished that wherever they're found in the forest now, they're pulled out. And Dave Sisko, who I talk about a lot in the book, who's the head of the Snail Extinction Prevention Program. He described this to me as an evacuation, and that's, I think, a very accurate term for what they're doing. They're basically pulling snails out wherever they can find them, because of the threats of these predators that are now moving up into the higher elevation, the very last refuges for some of the native snail species. So that's really the form that most of the conservation energy is being directed in Hawaii for snails at the moment. It's really about pulling them out of the forest and trying to get them established in these secure facilities. So it's a bit of it's a really a sad situation in a way, and I spend a bit of time in the book reflecting on what that means and where to from here, I guess, given that we can hold on to some of these things in captivity or in sort of quasi-captivity of a fenced bit of the forest, but there really isn't a plan beyond that for a way to restore them, if you like, to get them back into the forest in any fuller sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the last chapter is about hope in a time of loss, and the situation you described doesn't immediately sound hopeful. So what do you mean by this kind of hope? What is there to hope for right now?
Yeah, well, that last chapter is sort of me trying to come to terms with the story I've been telling in the book, and figure out what to make of it all. And I guess it came about that way because I got drawn into the snail community, as I described, and into really caring about these creatures and their future before I quite realized how bad it was. And I was sort of writing this book and then trying to understand what comes next for these snails. But then I guess the philosopher in me wanted to know, what does responsible care look like in this kind of a situation? So, if the snails can't be restored to the forest, and at this stage there isn't, nobody knows how all of those predators, especially the rosy wolf snail, might ever be removed from the forest, what that would look like. And of course that would come with its own violence and killing of these introduced species. But even if it could be done, I think people would jump at it by and large, and but nobody knows how to do it. And so until that can happen, really all we can do is hold on to the snails and hope something changes. So part of me was trying to understand whether this is the right thing to be doing. Should we just keep banking these species? Some of these species have been living primarily or only in captivity for decades. How long does this go on for? We don't really know what it means for a snail, whether they're living flourishing lives. I think that's a difficult but important question to be asking. And so that chapter is really trying to grapple with a kind of hopelessness, maybe, about the restoration of this species, but also to describe the really intimate care that goes on in this laboratory space that I've mentioned, where where people day in, day out are cleaning snail containers and washing snails under microscopes with pipettes to keep mites off them, and really trying to keep them alive, but for a very uncertain future. And I think that really is the situation that a lot of species are in today when we're honest about it. A lot of ex situ, out of the environment, out of the natural environment conservation, whether it's in a zoo or a captive breeding facility. A lot of those species will not get back into the world in a meaningful way. With reintroduction programs for a lot of species, most species fail. And so I think, and with the snails, when I was in the middle of writing the book in the beginning of 2019, Achatinella apex fulva, one of these snail species that had been living only in the laboratory for over a decade, the last individual of that species died, and the species went extinct. So it was a very tangible example of a species that that didn't make it back out into the world. And there will be others for whatever reasons as time goes on. So it's not a hypothetical when it comes to some species, and we just don't know how many of these species might ever get back out into the forest. So sorry, that's a very long explanation or summary of the situation that I was trying to think through. And I guess where I arrived at is trying to still make an argument for hope in this context. And hope and care, and the kind of mournful hope, I call it, that I'm arguing for in this final chapter is really about learning to hold on to both grief and hope, and seeing them not as diametrically opposed, but really as processes that infuse one another, and arguing that the best forms of that what that mournful hope might be is really about cultivating the best forms of relationship that are still available to us. So it's going to be very far from perfect, and yet there are still better and worse possibilities here. And so the work of working through what they are and working towards the better is, I think, something to still be very hopeful about. And I guess I'm riffing off Wendell Berry a little bit in that discussion, and thinking about a hope that's not really about success in any kind of utopian sense, but that is about cultivating the best possibilities still available. And I talk about that in particular in the context of not only the work of care that's going on in the lab, but also the work that people like I might do of telling these stories and bearing witness as part of that effort to be faithful to others, to do that work of mournful hope at the edge of extinction.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe the last thing I'll bring up, some of that discussion reminded me of, you have a chapter in Flightways about, I believe it's a crane species, but it's about birds raised in captivity and all kind of, or for captive breeding programs in particular, and all the, the elaborate lengths people need to go to really be able to provide adequate care to these birds and to offer them any chance of reintroduction, but also, the difficulties of bird life in captivity. And you mentioned the question of, is a snail flourishing in the ark? And, even if maybe the snail is unlikely to flourish in the wild, given the rosy wolf snail, there's this question that, you raise a couple points of where snails that are reintroduced from captivity might not have all the skills of a snail raised in the wild, or might have slightly different capabilities. And I think what I want to get at here is that there's so much we don't know about the mind of a snail, what's best for a snail, how, you bring up, we don't know how the snails got here or got to Hawaii. We have good theories, but we don't know how. We don't know how many types of snails first arrived in Hawaii. We don't know why the snails do certain behaviors. Some wander and just seemingly pick a direction and go with seemingly no end goal. And one of the other unknowns you brought up earlier toward the beginning of this discussion was we have decent numbers on what mammal and bird species are endangered or extinct or threatened, but we don't at all have decent numbers or statistics on invertebrates, including snails, including insects, and so on. So, you can pick one thread from all those or pick them all, but just this idea that there are many unknowns and mysteries pop up throughout your book that I noticed, and kind of how philosophically, ethically, scientifically do we navigate through a situation with so many unknowns?
Yeah, that's lovely that you picked up on that, because that is something that really struck me early on in writing the book, that just how much more shaky a lot of the ground I was finding myself on was than when I had been working with birds. And that happens again and again throughout the book, as you say, and you've given many of those great examples. The taxonomy one is one that really struck me, that we haven't talked about really yet, and that is that the profound uncertainty about how many species of snails there are in the world, or are in Hawaii, let alone the conservation status of each. Best estimates are that sort of about 80% of the world's invertebrates haven't even been described by science, let alone evaluated for their conservation status. And so one of the big it's a big theme in chapter 4, but in a way informing the whole book is this notion of an unknown extinction crisis, and thinking about what it means to be losing species that we don't even know are here. And of course, the science of taxonomy is not the only way that we know species are here. There are other knowledge systems and other ways of categorizing the world, but I think it's even within this kind of scientific paradigm, a scientific practice of taxonomy, for every species that we have a name for, even that we can describe in some often very limited way, roughly another 4 are probably disappearing that have never even been described by science. I think that's really deeply disturbing. I think what it says is that we really don't have a handle on, even an epistemological handle, let alone a kind of practical conservation handle on the extinction crisis. It is so far beyond the sphere of our reckoning that we can't make any meaningful sense of it. And so that is another space, I guess, of unknowability, or at least unknownness at the moment, that I am grappling with in the book, that was very different for me as somebody who had been working primarily on birds in the past. It comes up again and again in the book, and I guess it really does just reflect a very different level of investment and interest and concern for snails as compared to some other parts of our world. And that is one important thread of the story. But then I guess I'm also trying to do something different with the mystery and unknowability, and that's to make an argument for it as a sort of a precious thing to be held on to. Not because I want to celebrate ignorance, but because it's about a kind of humility, a kind of acceptance of ourselves as creatures in a world. And here I'm thinking with Debbie Rose, I think this is in chapter 1 or 2 of the book, thinking with Debbie Bird Rose, who's drawing on Gregory Bateson, thinking about what it means to be an inhabitant of a system, to live within a system, rather than to be outside studying it from above. And that is to necessarily be the kind of creature for whom the world reveals itself differently. And there are multiple different kinds of ways in which it can reveal itself. And so holding on to that mystery is about also holding on to a sense of ourselves as inhabitants of the world with these other creatures, in relationships with them. And any sort of, as Bateson argued, any healthy functioning system is complex and must have its spaces of mystery and unknowability. So I'm also advocating, in some sense, for this, while also pointing out the dangers and limitations of this lack of concern and regard for snails and other invertebrates.
Well, thank you for, being part of the movement to bring attention to these parts of the world, the invertebrate world. Is there anything else you want to add on any of this?
No, I think that we've covered everything. Thank you so much.
All right. Yeah. Well, thank you for coming on the show. The book is A World in a Shell, Snail Stories for a Time of Extinction. Thom Van Dooren, appreciate you coming on.
Thank you. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks so much for listening. If you made it this far, I hope you consider signing up for my free weekly newsletter, where you'll get updates about future episodes, as well as making that small monthly donation on Patreon to help keep this podcast going. The links for those are in the episode description. Subscribing on Patreon comes with perks such as early access to episodes, at certain tiers membership in the book club. You can submit questions for authors and stuff like that. So, hope you consider that, but either way, hope you have a great day.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.